look a lot at carbon capture and storage, bioenergy carbon capture and storage, and varying types of hydrogen. I also look a little bit at direct air capture, but that doesn't really exist at the moment. So I just keep an eye on it and then look at the UK and specifically Scottish landscape. So I'm going to give a brief overview of what CCS is, just in case people don't know much about it, and just a little bit of a context of the process of carbon capture, the history of carbon capture and storage and its current status, particularly in a global context. 2 case studies of CCS, and these case studies are often used by proponents of CCS as examples of why it's successful, but when you dig into it, it's a little bit more complex. Looking at who is pushing CCS and why, a little bit about what's going on in Scotland, and then some sort of alternatives to what we can do instead of carbon capture. So CCS, or carbon capture and storage, is considered a negative emission technology. The thing about this is that there's a lot of acronyms and it can be quite confusing. So often when talking about negative emission technologies, there's a lot of different things thrown about. So you hear CCS, which is carbon capture and storage, or you hear BECCS, which is bioenergy carbon capture and storage, or you hear DACS, which is direct air capture. And it can be really confusing. And I think often this is used by the fossil fuel industry very cleverly, because it sounds complex and it sounds very technical, and there's lots of different acronyms, but it's actually totally grand and very easy to understand. It's just once you get past those acronyms, it's fine. So CCS is a 3-step process. What happens is that emissions are theoretically captured at source, so usually on an energy point. So at a power station, for example, that carbon's captured theoretically again, and then it's transported through pipelines, and then it is stored. In Scotland, the storage sites for this captured carbon, theoretical captured carbon, would be under the North Sea in geological formations. The technical feasibility of CCS was demonstrated in 1996, for environmental reasons, but CCS as a concept has actually been around since the 1970s and 80s. I believe it was MIT that were looking into it, but it was proposed as a sort of environmental safeguard or something to cut emissions in 96, and we're still at this point where CCS is massively underrepresented. So it's been around for decades and decades and decades, and it still hasn't really materialized. Despite billions of dollars in funding, there's been billions of money, like billions of dollars chucked at CCS, and there's not really that much to show for it at this point. CCS largely gained a lot of traction in the past few years due to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 1.5 Special Degree Report. And negative emission technologies, which in that report are often referred to as carbon dioxide removals, but they're sort of one and the same, featured really heavily in there to reach those pathways. Largely, it was bioenergy carbon capture and storage, which is different to CCS. So that would be the planting of trees to sequester carbon, and then the burning of those trees for energy, and then theoretically the capturing of that carbon from the burning process. But BECCS was very heavy in the IPCC report, and to some extent CCS. And after that was published, there was a lot of discussion on negative emission technologies. I've got a nice little picture here to kind of show what it would look like. I found this sort of diagram actually from Shell, which is very useful. This is their diagram they made. So you can see that the first sort of point on that picture would be an energy plant, and they would capture the carbon, transport it, and then store it deep underground, and then measure and monitor it. In Scotland and the UK, I believe there isn't actually a particularly rigorous monitoring policy in place. I think it runs for about 5 to 10 years, but talk of CCS is that it would be there theoretically forever. So it's very, very important that when we're talking about CCS, we're also looking at a monitoring system and who's going to be looking at that, because it could be there theoretically for hundreds and hundreds of years, and there could be a chance of leakage of that carbon coming out. So very important to look at. So yeah, like I said, the technical feasibility of CCS was demonstrated in 96, but deployment of it has been really, really slow. So less than a fifth of CCS capacity under development in 2010 was actually operational by 2019. The scale of deployment of CCS is way less than people have predicted. There are only 26 CCS plants currently in operation globally. Now, I've put a little star there because the goalposts for carbon capture and storage change all the time. So the people who often report on the status of CCS are the Global Carbon Capture Society, and they are, they're big backers of CCS. So they kind of say, this is how many plants are in operation. And we sort of take them at their word. So sometimes they'll say it's 26, sometimes they'll say it's 31. And very recently, they decided to categorize CCS plants differently. So instead of it looking like a lot lower number, instead of it being, say, 26, it had climbed massively to something like 52. But then when you look into that number, they often classify CCS plants that are being planned or researched or are in discussion as CCS plants. It doesn't mean those plants are actually operational. They just started to categorize them very differently because it looks much more successful, and it looks much more sort of attractive to people that there are all these plants up and running. But today as well, there was an announcement that there are 40 CCS plants planned across 16 countries in Europe. Again, those things have been planned, those things have been proposed, but we are yet to see any CCS plant operational in the UK and any CCS plant operational within the EU. There is one in, I believe, Norway, but again, it's a very different type of CCS than has sort of been proposed, and it's not really there for environmental purposes. So global operational CCS capacity is currently 39 megatons of CO2 per year. Sorry, that's quite a techie thing to say. But yeah, you can see that this is about 0.1% of annual global emissions, and way less than Scotland's territorial emissions in 2018. So the capture rate of CCS at the moment is really, really, really low. Yeah, again, sites in development in 2010 with a potential capacity of 150 megatons a year ultimately resulted in 39 megatons by 2020. So again, CCS has a huge, very long history of being overpromised by industry, being overpromised by governments, and every single time it's super underdelivered. And the most important thing that's come out of some research that Friends of the Earth and Global Witness commissioned from the Tyndall Centre was that 81% of carbon capture to date through CCS plants has actually been used to extract more oil via a process of enhanced oil recovery. So what happens there is that the carbon is captured. They use that carbon to actually pump down into oil wells to try and get more oil that's difficult to reach, and they push that oil out. So CCS has been predominantly used for carbon emitting oil extraction that wouldn't otherwise have been possible. So when people say, actually, CCS is really successful, there's a long history of CCS, well, they're actually talking about is a process that has been used to extract oil and gas. It's not CCS capturing and storing it. So two of the key examples of CCS plants that are often talked about by industry are the Petronova plant, which is in America, and then the Boundary Dam, which is in Canada. Both of these are were coal CCS plants. And they have now both been mothballed because of prohibitive cost. So the financing of these projects relied solely on the process of enhanced oil recovery. So they basically got their money from getting more oil. So in 2020, when there was a fall in oil prices, this impacted the feasibility of these projects, and they both closed. A key driver as well for the Boundary Dam in Canada was that there was an environmental regulation put in by the Canadian government where they said that you have to retrofit your power plant, you have to cut down on your emissions, but you can do this through the process of EOR. So again, when these projects are talked about as successful, they're not talked about in an environmental way. They are not there to capture and store emissions. They are there to basically generate more emissions. So largely the people pushing it, as you can guess, are the fossil fuel industry. They're pushing very hard for CCS and hydrogen made from fossil gas. So hydrogen made from fossil gas is often referred to as blue hydrogen. And there's a big push to have CCS as a way to meet the Paris Agreement goals of sticking to 1.5. And then governments, global governments, are really keen to rely on CCS and rely on things like blue hydrogen to cut emissions as a sort of silver bullet technology, is this thing that's going to come along at the end of the decade and, yeah, cut emissions without really having to do the hard work. The Committee on Climate Change as well, so the CCC, the body that advises the UK and the Scottish government on its climate targets, have said that CCS is a necessity, not an option. So largely, if you talk critically about CCS, the Scottish government, and cite historical cases of overpromising and under-delivering, and if you cite enhanced oil recovery, there's a big pushback by the Scottish government citing the Committee on Climate Change, saying, well, they say it's a necessity, not an option. And often this is quite a big barrier because they rely really heavily on the CCC advice. And whilst some of that advice is really useful in terms of negative emission technologies, it can be very difficult to criticise the Scottish government because they fall back on the CCC. In a Scottish context, CCS and particularly blue hydrogen, so hydrogen made with fossil fuels and then those emissions captured by CCS, are really embedding themselves into sort of climate discussions and climate policy. So recently there was an announcement at Peterhead that instead of seeking a just transition and talking about how that would be, closed down in the future and engaging communities and workers, instead there was an announcement that they would be pursuing carbon capture and storage at Peterhead. The Acorn project is another really big project. It's the UK's furthest along CCS project. And when I say that, I do not mean it has started. We do not know when that will come on stream. There are some dates, but I've kept track of it for the past couple of years. And if you go on their website, sometimes they'll have a graphic up that says, we'll be up and running in 2023. And then you go back in 6 months and it says 2024. And then you go back in another 6 months and it says 2025. So the goalposts for when they're meant to be up and running is constantly moving. But the Acorn project is going to be located at St. Fergus. And largely when the Acorn project is referred to as a CCS project, it's important to note that what they actually are is a transportation and storage hub. They are not going to be capturing carbon. So they have, they say they have a small capture capacity to what they would call prime the pipes. And this is a tiny amount. I think it's kilotons of carbon, so minuscule. They would capture a tiny bit of carbon from a process. And then what that means is just because they can capture a tiny bit of carbon, they can call it a CCS project, but they cannot capture anywhere near what needs to be captured. They do not have the technical capability to capture, what's been promised. They're largely what they would call themselves a waste disposal system. So they would take other people's carbon emissions and then, again, theoretically store them. They're also pursuing direct air capture. Again, we haven't seen this materialized anywhere, but they're often talking about how they're going to do blue hydrogen, CCS, and direct air capture and be this big hub for negative emission technologies. I'm going to take you with me to my living room because my laptop is about to die. So I'm going to keep speaking to you while I walk. And then we also have some really big discussions about Mossmoran. So Mossmoran has obviously been noted for the flaring that's happening for the past, how many years? And one of the things that's being talked about there is CCS instead of, again, listening to the communities who are trying to seek a just transition for Mossmoran. And Exxon have also invested, I think, something like 140 million into retrofitting Mossmoran at the moment to put in a new ground source flare. So you can kind of see that the fossil fuel industry, particularly Shell, Drax as well, are really big into this, Total, are kind of going for these technologies as a way to continue fossil fuel extraction, anything but stopping fossil fuel extraction. At this point, I'm just going to plug this in, so bear with me. Thank you so much. 1 second. Thank you. Working from home is a bit of a nightmare. So I put up a picture of the Acorn proposal here, and what they're planning to do is repurpose already existing pipelines from oil and gas, particularly the Feeder 10 pipeline. And there's proposals that they would capture emissions from Grangemouth and then transport that all the way up to St. Fergus and then out into the North Sea. And that's what is really attractive to the Scottish government at this point, because it's meant to save millions and millions of pounds. So they say it's going to cost them, it's going to save them £750 million by repurposing these pipelines, but none of this has been demonstrated at all yet, which is very scary. In a Scottish context, in terms of policy, negative emission technologies such as CCS are making their way into every single thing and every single sector of the economy. So there's a hydrogen action plan that's forthcoming, where they see fossil hydrogen being used to decarbonize heating, to possibly decarbonize transport, so things like buses, and to an extent to decarbonize industry. Again, fossil hydrogen or blue hydrogen is always meant to be coupled with CCS. So whenever you hear talk of blue hydrogen, it means it's going to be CCS somewhere in there. The climate change plan update, which maps out how we're going to hit our climate targets, also included a new chapter this year. So it was published in December, and for the first time they had a new chapter which was solely dedicated to negative emission technologies. And in that, the Scottish government mapped out that 25% of all emissions that Scotland releases would be abated by negative emission technologies, which is huge. I think by 2032, they were relying on negative emission technologies coming in to take 25% of all of our territorial emissions. And they couldn't give any clear examples. There was no backup plan at all. And the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee, so the committees that hold the government to account on that climate change plan, went back and said, you need to basically create a plan B, because if this doesn't work, if the history of CCS failing comes to fruition in Scotland, we're going to miss our climate targets. You have to do things with proven solutions. Obviously, we went into the elections, and we now have new spokespeople, we have new MSPs. So one of the big challenges for environmental organisations, campaigners, activists, communities, is to make sure that the Scottish government are held to account on that advice that they were given. They have to make sure that they're planning this climate change plan on things that actually exist at this point. Also within buildings, there was a heat and building strategy recently published, and again, blue hydrogen all over it and CCS proposed. And there's tens of millions of funding coming from the Scottish government, the UK government and the EU, all towards CCS. And at this point, it's very, very hard to track who's getting that money, because there's partnerships. So Acorn have actually partnered with Shell. So at this point, who's getting that money? Is that money going to Shell? Is that a subsidy? It's very difficult to track at this point. So problems with CCS are numerous. Ultimately, you can see that it sort of extends the lifeline of oil and gas. Instead of basically stopping digging for oil and gas, what we're seeing here is just the increased exploration of oil and gas through EOR, and then also saying, well, actually, we can keep going, but we're going to capture it. It's unproven at scale. The costs are hugely, hugely prohibitive. The Petronova and Boundary Dam examples showed that it was not long-term viable at all. There was also residual emissions. So CCS, if it was to work theoretically, is not completely carbon neutral, it's not carbon negative. Theoretically, CCS can capture something like 90% of emissions. But the Petronova example showed that there was outages for 367 days and they missed targets by 17%, which is not an insignificant amount if we're talking about hitting climate targets. It keeps power in the hands of big corporations. The people who are getting to decide what climate solutions we are going to be relying on are still BP, there's still Shell, it's still massive oil majors who are getting to dictate how we reach our climate targets. And ultimately, what we could see is the undermining of a just transition. The Scottish government obviously say a lot, they have a lot of rhetoric about a just transition, and CCS massively plays into this. Like I said as well, a really big thing the Tinder report found is that CCS cannot make a meaningful contribution to 2030 climate targets. So CCS cannot be expected to make sure that we stay on track to 1.5 degrees. I'll also post in the chat the link to the Tinder report if anybody wants to see it. There's a briefing as well, which is, I think, a couple of pages long, which kind of gives the key points. And then for the people who are nerds, there's a really longer one that you can read, but it's really, really useful. So in terms of alternatives, I'd be really keen to hear what other people think about this as well. But largely what we're looking at is, the Tinder report found faster than expected progress on renewable technologies, energy storage and demand side technologies. Direct electrification is far more efficient than any form of hydrogen that we have now. And there are some really, really good reports that have come out that have shown that we can actually stick to 1.5 degrees that do not rely on negative emission technologies. So while the IPCC report has embedded a lot of CCS and BECCS into their pathways, there are other people who have come out and looked at different things. So one of those was the low energy demand scenario. And then the Heinrich Böll Institute in Germany also did a study last year, which centered degrowth and energy efficiency to reach 1.5. And if anybody wants to read those, I have them because I can go into depth about them and it'll take up way too much time, but I'm happy to post those in the chat as well. And yeah, natural climate solutions is another one as well. I'll add a little caveat as well that CCS, is very, very dangerous in the energy sector and the power sector, but there could be a role, at least it's my view, that there could be a role for carbon capture and storage in industry or sectors that are very, very hard to decarbonize where there are no other options. However, it's really important to note Scotland's industrial landscape. So it's not like the northeast of England where there are huge industrial clusters. Scotland's industry, again, an undermining of a just transition has sort of crumbled. We don't have a big steel industry. We do not have a big cement industry. What we do have is a big chemical industry. So there may be a role for CCS there. But ultimately, when there's talk of CCS in industry, it's important to contextualize it in Scotland and not rely on the sort of examples of the northeast of England. And I'm gonna stop there because I could ramble on about this forever.